In the gleaming towers of San Francisco's tech district, a brilliant engineer was about to discover the true cost of innovation. What started as 17 months of sleepless nights building revolutionary AI took a shocking turn when she came, face to face with corporate betrayal at its most calculated. Jaya Raman wasn't your typical software developer. For 8 years, she had spent her life architecting the impossible at Quantis Systems, known for turning theoretical algorithms into billion-dollar breakthroughs that could predict global market shifts with unprecedented accuracy. When she completed Q-Prime, the predictive AI system that would transform logistics forever, she had no idea she was walking into a carefully orchestrated erasure. Jaya watched executives celebrate her work while systematically removing her from every presentation, every credit, every trace of authorship that would lead to the most expensive talent management failure in Silicon Valley history. What began as a routine post-acquisition restructuring would become a masterclass in corporate consequence. The technology industry would never be the same after one forgotten engineer remembered that ownership and control were very different things, and that some innovations came with hidden keys only their creators could turn. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The cursor blinked green against the black terminal screen. 3:47 a.m. And I was still here, still watching lines of code cascade down like digital rain. The algorithm was finished. Not perfect, nothing ever is, but finished enough to change everything. My name is Jaya Raman. I'm 35 years old, and until this moment, I had never built something that could make a company worth more than $1 billion. But there it was, humming quietly in the server farm beneath Quantis Systems headquarters. 17 months of sleepless nights compressed into 47,000 lines of self-evolving predictive AI code that could forecast global logistics patterns with 94.7% accuracy. I saved the final optimization loop, closed my laptop, and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the San Francisco Bay. Dawn was creeping over the water painting, the sky in shades of amber and rose. The city was waking up, but I hadn't slept. The algorithm had consumed everything every weekend, every birthday, every moment I might have spent being human instead of being brilliant behind me. The open office hummed with the quiet energy of servers processing data, my architecture, my breakthrough embedded deep in the code where nobody bothered to look, was Clause 17, for a licensing lock I had written in the early hours of development when paranoia felt more like preparation than fear. All operations to remain under direct oversight of original architect authorization required for system-wide deployment? It wasn't malicious, just careful. The elevator dinged behind me. Mira Kwong stepped out balancing 2 coffee cups and a stack of presentation folders. She was 26, bright-eyed, and the only person at Quantis who still called me by my first name instead of my employee ID number. "You never left, did you?" she said, handing me the larger cup. It was still warm chai latte with an extra shot, the way I liked it when I was too tired to taste anything else. "Finished it," I said, nodding toward my workstation. "The final deployment is ready. The algorithm can scale globally. Now, no more crashes, no more data bottlenecks. It can handle anything." Mira's eyes widened. She had been tracking the project since her internship 2 years ago, watching me build something that started as a logistics optimizer and evolved into something that could predict supply chain failures 3 months in advance, identify market shifts before they happened, optimize shipping routes across 14 time zones. Simultaneously, it wasn't just code, it was digital prophecy. "Jaya, this is going to change everything," she whispered. "The board meeting is in 4 hours. They're announcing the acquisition offer from Steinberg International $1 billion. They're going to buy us because of this, because of what you built." I nodded, but something cold was already settling in my chest, the way it always did when success felt too easy, when recognition felt too close. I had been at Quantis for 8 years, long enough to know how credit moved through the building like a game of telephone, starting with engineering and ending with executives. "Who's presenting today?" I asked. Mira's smile faltered slightly. "Elliot Marsh is leading the Tech Overview Board wanted someone with more presentation experience. Elliot Marsh, the new head of AI strategy hired 6 months ago from McKinsey with an MBA and a smile that could sell sand to a desert. He understood buzzwords better than backpropagation, could talk about machine learning like poetry, but couldn't debug a simple loop to save his career. What about the technical deep dive? I asked. The architecture explanation, the deployment strategy. He'll cover the high-level vision, Mira said. Carefully, you're listed as key support staff in the appendix. Key support staff, 17 months of 18-hour days reduced to a footnote. I had expected this, but expecting a punch doesn't make it hurt less. I was the architect, the creator, the mind behind every innovation that would make Quantis worth acquiring. But in 4 hours, when investors and executives gathered in the mahogany boardroom, I would be invisible. I need to review the presentation, I said. Mira hesitated. Jaya, I tried to get you added to the speaker list, but Elliot said the board prefers a unified voice, fewer technical details, more strategic vision. Strategic vision. My algorithm could predict global shipping patterns, but apparently I couldn't predict my own erasure. I walked back to my desk and opened the presentation slides Elliot had prepared. They were beautiful, polished graphics that made complex mathematics look like modern art, but they were wrong. Not completely wrong, just wrong enough to reveal that he didn't understand what he was selling. Slide 7 claimed the algorithm used standard neural network architecture. It didn't. It used a hybrid approach I had developed that combined reinforcement learning with evolutionary computing. Slide 12 promised 99% accuracy we had never achieved above 94. 7%, and I had been careful to document our limitations. Slide 15 showed a deployment timeline that ignored the 3-month calibration period required for new market integration. I could have corrected the slides, could have sent an email flagged the inconsistencies, but something stopped me. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the quiet recognition that they had already decided who would get credit for my work. Instead, I opened the algorithm's core configuration, file and reviewed clause 17. For the 100th time, it was still there, buried in the licensing documentation like a digital time bomb waiting for someone to read the fine print authorization required for system-wide deployment. Original architect retains override privileges. For security and integrity maintenance, they had signed off on the licensing agreement 8 months ago when legal reviewed the development framework. Nobody read the technical clauses. They trusted that I was just protecting the company from security vulnerabilities, but clause 17. 4 was more than a security measure. It was insurance at 8:30 a.m. The boardroom filled with suits and spreadsheets. I watched through the glass walls as Elliot presented my algorithm like a magic trick. He talked about artificial intelligence revolution, the future of predictive analytics, the dawn of a new era in global logistics. His hands moved gracefully across the screen, highlighting charts and graphs that represented months of my life, compressed into quarterly projections. The investors nodded, approved, asked questions about scalability, market penetration, competitive advantages. Elliot answered smoothly, confidently, incorrectly. He promised deployment across 15 countries within 6 months when the algorithm needed at least 18 months for proper integration. He guaranteed 99% accuracy when our best models peaked at 94.7%. He spoke about the architecture, like he had designed it personally. I wasn't in the room, but I could see everything through the glass partition, watching my work transformed into someone else's vision. My breakthrough becoming his breakthrough. My sleepless nights becoming his career advancement at 10:15 a.m. The applause started. Investors stood, executives shook hands. Steinberg International had agreed to acquire Quantis for $1 billion contingent on successful deployment of the predictive algorithm. My algorithm, the one I had built, line by line, function by function, in the dark hours when the office was empty and the city slept. Elliot emerged from the boardroom, glowing with reflected success. A cluster of executives surrounded him, congratulating him on his revolutionary work. his innovative approach, his strategic vision. He had presented my creation so convincingly that even I almost believed he had built it. Mira found me at my desk. An hour later, her face was careful, controlled the way it looked when she was processing something she didn't want to accept. "They're calling it Q Prime," she said quietly. "The marketing team is already working on the brand rollout. They want to position it as Quantis's flagship innovation, Elliot's signature achievement. Q Prime. My algorithm had a new name, a name that erased any connection to its creator. I had built something revolutionary, and they had rebranded it like a consumer product, cleaned it up, made it presentable, removed any trace of the woman who had sacrificed everything to create it. "There's something else," Mira said. "HR wants to see you at 2 p.m. They said it's about your role in the post-acquisition structure." I nodded, but I was already thinking about Clause 17. 4. About the licensing lock that nobody had noticed, about the authorization key that only I could activate. They thought they owned my algorithm completely, absolutely, irrevocably. But ownership was more complicated than they realized. The morning dissolved into afternoon emails, phone calls, congratulations from colleagues who didn't know they were congratulating the wrong person. By 1:45 p.m., I was walking toward the HR office carrying a folder of documentation that nobody would read. Just like nobody had read the licensing clauses that could change everything in 4 hours. Quantis had become a billion-dollar company based on my work, but somehow I knew the real story was just beginning. The conference room smelled like fresh coffee and corporate optimism. 2 cups sat on the polished table, neither for me. Elliot Marsh sat across from Rebecca Chen, our head of HR, both wearing expressions I had seen before, the kind of practiced sympathy that preceded bad news delivered with corporate efficiency. "Jaya, please sit," Rebecca said, her voice too bright. Too careful the way people talk when they've rehearsed difficult conversations. I sat and placed my hands flat on the table, a habit I had developed during performance reviews. Still stay calm. Let them reveal their intentions before revealing yours. Rebecca slid a manila envelope across the mahogany surface. My name typed neatly on the label, like someone had triple-checked the spelling. "We wanted to discuss your role in Quantis's exciting new chapter," Elliot said, leaning forward with manufactured enthusiasm. "The acquisition has created tremendous opportunities for growth, and we're restructuring to ensure we have the right people in the right positions." The right people. I had built the algorithm that made this acquisition possible, but apparently I wasn't the right person to discuss it. Rebecca opened her portfolio and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Official letterhead company logo, my employee ID number at the top. "Effective immediately, your title will be changed to Data Strategy Associate," Rebecca said without looking up. "This reflects our new organizational structure and ensures optimal resource allocation across departments. Data Strategy Associate." I had been senior machine learning engineer, the architect of their billion-dollar breakthrough, and now I was being retitled with corporate newspeak that meant nothing to anyone who understood actual technology. "What does that role entail?" I asked. "You'll be supporting our data initiatives across multiple departments," Elliot said, "providing technical expertise where needed, contributing to strategic planning documents, ensuring our data practices align with industry standards, supporting initiatives, contributing to documents." I was being transformed from creator to consultant, from architect to assistant. The algorithm I had built would power Quantis's future, but I would no longer guide its development and compensation. I asked. Rebecca's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Given the restructuring and budget realignments, your new salary will be $47,000 annually, down from your current $156,000. This reflects the associate-level responsibilities of your new position. 70%. I sat very still while the number processed a 70% pay cut for the woman who had created their most valuable asset. They were paying me less than a junior developer, less than the interns who fetched coffee and took meeting notes, less than the marketing associates who would write press releases about my algorithm under someone else's name. I see, I said, because there was nothing else to say in that moment. No argument that would change their decision, no logic that would penetrate their predetermined narrative. They had decided I was replaceable, and now they were making it official. We know this is a significant change, Rebecca continued, but we're confident you'll find the new role challenging and rewarding. There's tremendous opportunity for growth within the associate track. Growth opportunity. They were offering me the chance to climb back up to where I had already been, except now someone else occupied the summit I had built. When does this take effect? I asked immediately. Elliot said, we'll need to transition your current projects to the appropriate team leads. I'll be taking over the Q Prime development personally, ensuring continuity during the acquisition process. Q Prime, he said it like he had named it himself, like the 17 months I had spent developing the algorithm were just preliminary research, that he would now transform into something meaningful. He had been at Quantis for 6 months and couldn't explain the difference between supervised and unsupervised learning, but he would be taking over personally, and my office. I asked, we'll be transitioning you to the collaborative workspace on the 3rd floor. Rebecca said, collaborative workspace, the corporate euphemism for cubicles where junior employees worked under fluorescent lights without windows or doors, or any physical indication that their contributions mattered. I had gone from having my own office with a view of the bay to sharing space with entry-level analysts. My nameplate would be removed. My projects reassigned, my access privileges downgraded. I was being systematically erased from the company I had helped transform. Do you have any questions about the transition? Rebecca asked. Yes, I had questions. I wanted to know how they could justify paying their most valuable engineer less than their parking garage attendant. I wanted to understand how the person who created their billion-dollar algorithm could be deemed worthy of associate-level compensation. I wanted to ask if they understood that Q Prime was more than code. It was architecture, philosophy, innovation, compressed into functions and variables that nobody else could replicate, but I didn't ask those questions because I already knew the answers. They weren't paying me for what I had built. They were paying me to stay quiet, to accept my demotion gracefully, to disappear into the collaborative workspace where my expertise could be accessed without credit or recognition. No questions. I said, excellent, Elliot said, standing up and extending his hand for a handshake. I didn't take it. I'm looking forward to working with you in your new capacity, Jaya. Your technical background will be invaluable as we scale Q Prime across global markets. Invaluable, but not valuable enough to keep my title, my office, my salary, or my recognition. I stood up and picked up the envelope containing my new employment terms. One more thing, Rebecca said as I reached the door. We'll need you to sign a revised non-disclosure agreement. Given your transition to a support role, we want to ensure proper confidentiality around our strategic initiatives. Strategic initiatives, they wanted me to sign papers, promising not to discuss the algorithm. I had created the work I had done, the innovations I had developed. They were erasing me from the narrative and asking me to help with the erasure. I'll review it, I said. Great. We'll need it back by Friday. Rebecca smiled. And Jaya, congratulations on being part of Quantis's incredible success story. Success story? I walked out of the conference room carrying an envelope that reduced my career to $47. Was zero a year and a title that could mean anything or nothing depending on who was asking by 4 p.m. My office was being emptied by facilities management, my personal items packed into 2 cardboard boxes, my nameplate already removed from the door. Mira found me sitting in the hallway watching strangers dismantle the space where I had spent 8 years building my career. This is insane, she whispered, sitting beside me on the floor. Everyone knows you created Q Prime. Everyone knows this acquisition happened because of your work. Everyone knew, but knowing wasn't the same as acknowledging, and acknowledging wasn't the same as acting. I had learned the difference between recognition and reward, between being essential and being valued. What are you going to do? Mira asked. I thought about Clause 17. 4 buried in the licensing documentation about the authorization key that only I controlled about the algorithm that would soon power global logistics operations without anyone understanding. It's true architecture. I'm going to be a data strategy associate, I said, at least for now. Mira studied my face looking for anger or despair, or the kind of emotional reaction that would be normal for someone whose career had just been demolished. But I felt something else, something colder and more patient. I was going to watch Q Prime launch across international markets. I was going to observe Elliot present my work at conferences and industry events. I was going to let them believe they owned something they had never bothered to understand completely. And when the right moment came, when they realized that their billion-dollar algorithm needed more than a charming presentation to function at scale, I would be ready with the authorization, key they didn't know they needed. For now, I would accept my demotion gracefully, professionally, quietly, but acceptance wasn't surrender, and patience wasn't weakness. It was strategy. The third floor smelled like industrial carpet and broken dreams. Rows of gray cubicles stretched across the open workspace under humming fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly ill. I found my new desk tucked between a junior analyst, who spent most of his day on LinkedIn, and a marketing coordinator, who took calls about social media, engagement metrics, no nameplate, no window, no door, just a particle board surface and a rolling chair that squeaked. When I leaned back, the computer was older than my algorithm, already struggling to run the development environments I needed to review Q Prime's deployment status. Across the room hung a massive monitor displaying the company org chart updated daily to reflect Quantis's new structure. I stared at it during my first coffee break, searching for my name somewhere in the digital hierarchy. I wasn't there. Not in engineering, not in strategy, not even in the footnotes that listed administrative support staff. Jaya Raman had been erased. Elliot Marsh's photo occupied the top of the AI division, labeled Head of Artificial Intelligence Innovation. Beneath him were team leads. I had trained engineers who had worked on my projects, managers who had learned machine learning terminology from presentations I had given, but my name appeared nowhere in the structure that supported Quantis's most valuable asset. I opened my laptop and navigated to the internal documentation portal where Q Prime's technical specifications were stored. What I found made my stomach clench with a mixture of rage and dark satisfaction. They had renamed everything. The core neural network architecture I had developed was now called Marsh Predictive Framework. The evolutionary computing hybrid I had pioneered was labeled MPF Optimization Engine. Even the data pre-processing pipeline I had built from scratch had been rebranded as Quantis Advanced Analytics Suite. But they had missed something buried in the metadata of every file, every function. Every line of code were my initials, JR, stamped invisibly into the digital DNA of the system that would make them billions. Nobody looked at metadata. Nobody read the technical comments embedded in the source code. They saw the pretty interface and assumed they understood the architecture beneath. I clicked through 17 different files, each one bearing the invisible signature of its true creator, while displaying Elliot's name in the official documentation. It was like watching someone else wear your clothes to a party and receive compliments on their fashion sense. My phone buzzed with a Slack message from Mira, who was now working in the marketing department writing press releases about innovation she understood better than the executives who claimed credit for them. All hands meeting in 20 minutes. They're announcing the Q Prime rollout strategy. I walked to the main conference room where 200 Quantis employees gathered to hear about their company's bright future. Elliot stood at the front of the room wearing a tailored suit and the kind of confident smile that came from knowing everyone in the audience believed he was brilliant. 6 months ago, we embarked on an ambitious journey to revolutionize global logistics. He began, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of someone who had given this presentation before. Today, I'm proud to announce that Q Prime, our flagship AI platform, is ready for international deployment. Our flagship AI platform, He talked about Q Prime like a proud parent describing a child's first steps, except he hadn't been there for the sleepless nights, the failed experiments, the breakthrough moments that happened at 3 a.m. when inspiration struck like digital lightning. Q Prime represents a fundamental breakthrough in predictive analytics. Elliot continued clicking through slides that displayed my architecture as colorful flowcharts. Using advanced machine learning techniques, we've created a system that can forecast global supply chain disruptions with unprecedented accuracy. Advanced machine learning techniques. I had spent 2 years developing the hybrid approach that made Q Prime possible, combining reinforcement learning with evolutionary computing, in ways that had never been attempted at scale, but Elliot described it like a standard implementation, something any competent engineer could have built. Our initial deployments will focus on European markets, he said, with plans to expand across Asia-Pacific and Latin America. Within 18 months, we're projecting revenue increases of 340% as Q Prime transforms how our clients manage global logistics. 18 months, I had explicitly documented that international expansion would require at least 24 months for proper calibration and testing. But Elliot was promising delivery timelines that ignored technical reality in favor of investor expectations. The audience applauded politely as Elliot outlined deployment strategies that demonstrated his fundamental misunderstanding of the algorithm's requirements. He talked about plug-and-play implementation. When Q Prime needed months of market-specific training, he promised seamless integration when the system required careful calibration to local regulatory environments. I sat in the back row watching my life's work transformed into marketing bullet points, while the person who created it remained invisible to the room that would profit from her innovation after the meeting. Mira found me at the coffee station, her face tight with barely controlled frustration. "This is insane," she whispered. "He's promising things that are technically impossible. You told me yourself that European deployment would need 6 months of testing minimum." "He doesn't know that," I said, stirring sugar into coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since the Clinton administration. "He's never looked at the actual implementation requirements, just the high-level specifications. What happens when the deployments fail, when clients realize the system doesn't work the way he's promising?" I thought about Clause 17. Or about the authorization protocols embedded so deeply in Q Prime's architecture that removing them would require rebuilding the entire system from scratch. "That depends," I said, "on whether they remember to read the documentation." That afternoon, I accessed Q Prime's deployment dashboard using my new associate-level credentials, which still granted me red access to system monitoring tools. What I saw confirmed my suspicions. They were rushing implementation, treating my algorithm like commercial software that could be installed and activated without proper preparation. The European pilot was scheduled to launch in 3 weeks with minimal testing and no calibration period. They were planning to process live logistics data for clients across 14 countries using a system that had never operated outside the controlled environment of Quantis's development servers. I opened the licensing documentation and scrolled to Clause 17. 4. The legal language was dry, bureaucratic, almost invisible among the standard terms and conditions, but its implications were clear. All operations to remain under direct oversight of original architect. Authorization required for system-wide deployment. In the event of unauthorized usage, the architect retains the right to suspend access for security and integrity purposes. They had signed this agreement, they had approved this clause, they had accepted that Q Prime required ongoing oversight from its creator, but they seemed to have forgotten that the person whose authorization they needed was currently sitting in a third-floor cubicle earning $47,000 a year. I closed the documentation and opened my email. 3 new messages from Syntech recruiters who had been trying to reach me for months. I had ignored them before dismissing their offers as lateral moves that wouldn't advance my career, but lateral was starting to look appealing compared to the vertical drop I had just experienced. The last email was from Malik Serrano, CEO of Syntech himself. The subject line was simple. "Coffee?" I stared at the message for a long time, thinking about Clause 17. 4 about authorization protocols about what happened when companies forgot that their most valuable assets couldn't be owned. Only licensed. Malik Serrano wanted to have coffee with the woman who had been erased from Quantis's success story, the architect, who had been reclassified as an associate, the creator who had been written out of her own narrative. Maybe it was time to remember that licensing agreements worked both ways. That control wasn't something you could take. It was something you had to earn, and when you stopped earning it, you lost it. Regardless of what your org chart claimed, I clicked reply and typed a single word. When. Outside the windows of the third-floor workspace, San Francisco glittered in the afternoon sun, a city built on innovation and reinvention, where fortunes changed as quickly as algorithms compiled somewhere in that city. Malik Serrano was waiting to hear from the woman who held the keys to a billion-dollar system, and somewhere in Quantis's executive offices. Elliot Marsh was planning a deployment that required authorization he didn't know he needed from a person he had forgotten existed. I hit send and leaned back in my squeaky chair, watching the numbers cascade across Q Prime's monitoring dashboard. The algorithm I had built was preparing to change the world, but they had forgotten to ask if I wanted to let them. 11:47 p.m., and the third floor was empty except for the hum of servers and the distant sound of cleaning crews moving through. The executive offices above me, I had stayed late. Not because I had work that couldn't wait until morning, but because the collaborative workspace felt different after hours. Less like a corporate purgatory and more like what it actually was, a place where people who understood technology came to build things that mattered. My screen glowed with terminal windows and encrypted chat clients, the kind of tools that let engineers communicate without leaving digital breadcrumbs in corporate monitoring systems. I had spent the last 3 hours reaching out to people I had worked with over the years, former colleagues who had moved to other companies, current team members who still trusted my technical judgment, former interns who remembered when I had taught them the difference between theory and implementation. The responses had been illuminating. Sarah Chen, now a senior architect at Adobe, confirmed what I had suspected. Q Prime's dependencies were more extensive than Quantis realized. My algorithm wasn't just powering the logistics platform, it was integrated into their customer analytics engine, their resource optimization tools, their predictive maintenance systems. Removing me from the equation would create cascading failures. Across multiple departments, David Park, who had left Quantis 6 months ago to join Uber's AI team, sent a more direct message through Signal. They're fucked if they lose you and they don't even know it. But the most interesting response came from someone I hadn't expected to hear from. Marcus Way had been my intern 3 years ago, a quiet kid from UC Berkeley who understood advanced mathematics better than most PhD candidates. He was now working at Syntech, leading their machine learning infrastructure team. Heard about your situation, he wrote in an encrypted chat. Interesting timing. We've been analyzing Quantis's public statements about Q Prime. There are some significant technical inconsistencies in their deployment claims. I typed back carefully. What kind of inconsistencies? The kind that suggest whoever is making promises doesn't understand the underlying architecture. Marcus replied, accuracy claims that exceed published benchmarks, deployment timelines that ignore testing requirements, integration promises that assume plug-and-play functionality for systems that clearly need custom calibration. He was describing Elliot's presentation from the all-hands meeting, the confident promises that had impressed investors while revealing fundamental gaps in technical understanding, hypothetically speaking. Marcus continued, if someone wanted to demonstrate those inconsistencies publicly, it wouldn't be difficult. The claims are already in the public record. I stared at the message for a long time, thinking about what he was suggesting. Not sabotage exactly, but transparency, making visible the gap between marketing promises and technical reality. My phone buzzed with a notification from the internal Slack channel Mira had created for monitoring company communications. She had added me using a fake account that HR wouldn't trace back to either of us. The channel was called Weather Updates, but it had nothing to do with meteorology tonight's. Weather report was particularly stormy. Mira had been documenting the paper trail of my erasure forwarding emails that revealed the decision-making process behind my demotion. The messages painted a picture of calculated elimination, not budget, constraints or organizational restructuring, but deliberate removal of someone who knew too much about the technology that would define Quantis's future. One email chain from 2 weeks before my demotion showed Elliot discussing the Jaya problem with Rebecca from HR. She's too closely associated with the Q Prime development, Elliot had written. Investors want to see unified leadership for the acquisition. Having the actual architect in a senior role creates complications for narrative consistency. Narrative consistency. They had reduced my career to a storytelling problem, my expertise to a complication that needed managing. Another email revealed the salary calculation that led to my 70% pay cut. Rebecca had researched market rates for technical support associates positions that typically required bachelor's degrees and 2 years of experience, then applied those rates to someone with a PhD in computer science and 8 years of specialized AI development. They weren't paying me based on my value to the company, they were paying me based on how little they thought they could get away with while keeping me quiet about what I knew. But the most revealing message came from Jordan Alessi, the chief legal officer who had signed off on my original licensing agreement. The intellectual property documentation seems comprehensive. Jordan had written, standard work-for-hire clauses should cover any technical contributions. The licensing framework appears to be boilerplate security language, nothing that would complicate ownership transfer. Boilerplate security language. Jordan had dismissed. Clause 17. 4. Without reading it carefully enough to understand its implications, he had assumed that because it was buried in technical documentation, it must be unimportant, just another layer of corporate legal protection. I opened Q Prime's deployment dashboard and checked the system status. Everything was running smoothly, because I had built it to run smoothly. The European pilot was still scheduled to launch in 2 weeks, with Elliot promising seamless integration to clients who had paid millions for access to revolutionary AI technology. What they didn't know was that revolutionary AI technology required revolutionary oversight, the kind that couldn't be delegated to someone who understood management better than mathematics. I opened a new terminal window and began typing code. Not malicious code, just diagnostic tools that would help me monitor Q Prime's performance across different deployment scenarios. I wanted to understand exactly what would happen when Elliot's promises collided with technical reality. The European markets presented unique challenges that required careful algorithm adaptation. Different regulatory environments, varying data, quality standards, complex integration requirements that I had spent months documenting, but that weren't reflected in the deployment timeline Elliot had presented to investors. I created monitoring scripts that would track system performance accuracy rates, error frequencies, the kind of metrics that would reveal whether Q Prime was actually delivering the results Elliot had promised, or just producing impressive-looking visualizations that masked underlying problems. My phone buzzed again. Marcus had sent another message. By the way, he wrote, Malik wants to meet with you. He's been following your work for years, thinks Quantis doesn't appreciate what they have. Malik Serrano, CEO of Syntech. The man who had sent me the coffee invitation that I still hadn't responded to properly. Marcus was telling me that Syntech's interest wasn't casual recruitment. It was strategic recognition of an opportunity that Quantis had created through their own short-sightedness. I thought about the authorization key embedded in Q Prime's core architecture, about the licensing clause that nobody had bothered to read. Carefully about what would happen when a billion-dollar algorithm needed oversight, that its current handlers couldn't provide outside the windows of the 3rd floor. San Francisco glittered like a circuit board against the dark sky somewhere in that maze of light and ambition. Malik Serrano was waiting to hear from the woman who held keys to technology that could reshape global logistics. I opened my email and found Malik's message still sitting in my inbox subject line. Coffee? I clicked reply and began typing. Thursday 2 p.m. Ritual Coffee Roasters on Valencia Street. I'll be the one who built the algorithm everyone else is taking credit for. I hit send before I could second-guess the decision. Then I went back to my monitoring. Scripts adding layers of analysis that would track every aspect of Q Prime's performance once it launched in European markets. I wanted comprehensive data about what happened when marketing promises met mathematical reality. By 1:30 a.m., I had created a complete surveillance framework for my own algorithm tools that would let me monitor its performance accuracy problems, deployment failures, all from my associate-level workstation in the collaborative workspace, where Quantis had tried to bury me. I saved everything to encrypted drives that couldn't be accessed through corporate networks, then cleared my browser history and logged out of all the systems that had tracked my late-night activities. As I walked to the elevator, I passed the executive floor where Elliot probably wasn't working late because managing other people's innovations didn't require the kind of obsessive attention that creating them demanded tomorrow. He would continue presenting my work as his vision promising. Capabilities he didn't understand to clients who trusted that Quantis knew what they were selling. And tomorrow, I would sit in my squeaky chair in my windowless cubicle, monitoring the algorithm I had built while waiting for Thursday afternoon, when I would finally have coffee with someone who understood the difference between ownership and control. The elevator doors closed, and I descended through the building that had made me invisible, carrying knowledge that would soon become very valuable to the right person. Quantis thought they had neutralized the Jaya problem, but they had only created the Jaya opportunity and opportunities. Unlike algorithms could be transferred to whoever offered the best terms. Ritual Coffee Roasters on Valencia Street buzzed with the kind of energy that made San Francisco feel like the center of the digital universe. Laptops hummed conversations mixed technical jargon with venture capital gossip, and every table seemed to host someone building the next thing that would change everything. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I arrived 15 minutes early and chose a corner table where I could see the entrance. Malik Serrano walked in at exactly 2 p.m. scanning the room, with the kind of focused attention that suggested he was used to evaluating situations quickly. He was smaller than I had expected from his conference appearances, maybe 5'7", with graying hair, and the kind of understated confidence that came from building companies rather than just managing them. He spotted me immediately, walked over without hesitation, and extended his hand. "Jaya Raman," he said, sitting down across from me. "The woman who built the future of predictive logistics and got paid like a junior consultant. Direct." I appreciated that too many executives wasted time with small talk when they were really here to discuss business. "You've done your research." I said, "I always research the people I want to work with." Malik replied, "And I've been wanting to work with you for a long time, long before Quantis decided to demonstrate their talent management philosophy." He had ordered coffee before sitting down, a cortado that he sipped while studying my face, like he was reading code looking for the underlying logic that explained surface behaviors. "Let me be direct," he continued. "Syntech has been tracking Q Prime's development for months. We know what it can do, we know what it can't do, and we know who actually built it." "And what do you think it can do?" I asked. Malik leaned forward slightly. "Revolutionize global supply chain management, predict market disruptions before they cascade, optimize shipping routes across multiple time zones, simultaneously reduce logistics costs by an average of 23% while improving delivery accuracy by 40%. Those were my numbers, the projections I had calculated during late-night testing sessions when I was measuring Q Prime's performance against real-world scenarios. Malik knew my algorithm better than the executives who were selling it. "But there's a problem," he continued. "The people currently controlling Q Prime don't understand its limitations. They're making promises about deployment timelines and accuracy rates that suggest fundamental gaps in technical comprehension." I thought about Elliot's presentation about 18-month international expansion schedules. that ignored market calibration requirements about 99% accuracy claims that exceeded our actual capabilities. What makes you think they can't deliver what they're promising? I asked. Malik smiled and pulled out his phone, opening a presentation that looked familiar. It was Elliot's pitch deck from the investor meeting, but annotated with technical corrections. Highlighted inconsistencies, mathematical impossibilities marked in red. Our engineering team analyzed the public statements Quantis has made about Q Prime. Malik said, scrolling through slides that revealed the gap between marketing and mathematics. Either they're deliberately misleading investors, or they genuinely don't understand the technology they're selling. Probably both. I had watched Elliot promise capabilities that would require years of additional development while displaying architecture, diagrams that contained fundamental errors. Here's what I know. Malik continued, closing the presentation. You spent 17 months building something revolutionary. Quantis reduced your salary by 70% and gave your title to someone who understands presentation software better than predictive algorithms. They think they own your work, but ownership is more complicated than corporate org charts suggest. He had done his research thoroughly enough to understand that technical innovation couldn't be transferred like office equipment, that algorithms, especially ones as sophisticated as Q Prime, required ongoing oversight from people who understood their mathematical foundations. I have a proposition. Malik said, double your current salary, full creative control over AI development projects, your own team, your choice of office location, and one condition: you bring Q Prime or nothing. Double my current salary would still be less than I had been making at Quantis before the demotion, but full creative control was worth more than money, especially after months of watching other people make decisions about my work. How would that work legally? I asked. Quantis owns the intellectual property. Do they? Malik asked. Or do they own a license to technology that requires specific authorization for deployment? He knew about Clause 17. 4. Somehow, Syntech had discovered the licensing arrangement that Quantis had signed without reading carefully the authorization protocol that nobody at my current company seemed to remember existed. You've read the documentation. I said, we've read everything, including the technical specifications that reveal how thoroughly Quantis misunderstands what they're trying to deploy. Malik replied, they're planning to launch Q Prime across European markets without proper calibration testing. They're promising plug-and-play integration for systems that require months of customization. They're treating revolutionary AI like commercial software. Everything he was describing matched my own assessment of Elliot's deployment strategy promises, that prioritized investor satisfaction over technical feasibility. What happens when they realize their mistakes? I asked. That depends on whether they can fix them, Malik said, and whether the person who built Q Prime is available to help or has moved on to work with people who appreciate her contributions. The offer was tempting, not just because of the salary or the creative control, but because of what it represented: recognition that my work had value beyond what Quantis was willing to acknowledge, validation that expertise couldn't be transferred through corporate restructuring. But accepting would mean leaving behind 8 years at a company that had made me invisible. Walking away from the algorithm I had built to watch someone else struggle with technology they didn't understand. I need to think about it. I said, of course. Malik replied. But while you're thinking, consider this. Quantis is planning to deploy Q Prime internationally in 2 weeks. They're promising capabilities that require authorization they don't have from someone they've forgotten they need. If those deployments fail publicly, it won't just damage their reputation, it will undermine confidence in predictive AI across the entire industry. He was right. Failed deployments wouldn't just hurt Quantis. They would validate skepticism about AI capabilities that the entire tech sector was working to overcome. You could prevent that. Malik continued, by ensuring Q Prime is deployed correctly, by people who understand its requirements, or you could let them learn the hard way what happens when marketing promises collide with mathematical reality. I thought about the monitoring scripts I had created, about the diagnostic tools that would track Q Prime's performance once it launched in European markets, about what those tools might reveal if Elliot's deployment strategy proved as flawed as I suspected. "What exactly are you offering?" I asked. "Leadership of Syntech's AI development division, complete autonomy over technical decisions, your choice of team members, and the resources to build whatever you think comes next after Q Prime," Malik said. "Plus the satisfaction of working for people who read licensing agreements carefully." He stood up and placed a business card on the table. Simple white paper with his direct phone number and email address. "Take your time." He said, "But not too much time. Q Prime launches in 13 days, and after that the conversation becomes more complicated for everyone involved." He walked away, leaving me alone with a cortado that had gone cold and a business card that represented everything Quantis had refused to offer: recognition, respect, the opportunity to control my own innovations. I sat in ritual coffee for another hour, watching other conversations about technology and ambition, while thinking about authorization keys and deployment failures. About what happened when companies forgot that their most valuable assets weren't owned but licensed by 4 p.m. I had made my decision not about Malik's offer exactly, but about what I needed to know before I could decide. I needed to see what happened. When Q Prime launched without proper authorization, when Elliot's promises were tested against technical reality, when a billion-dollar algorithm met the market conditions it had never been calibrated to handle, I needed to watch Quantis discover what they had actually signed when they approved Clause 17. 4. Only then would I know whether Malik's offer was an opportunity or just another way to be someone else's solution to problems they had created for themselves. I walked back to Quantis carrying knowledge that was about to become very expensive, and a business card from someone who understood that expertise couldn't be erased, only relocated. 13 days until everything changed. 12 days until Quantis learned the difference between owning code and controlling technology. 11 days. Until I decided whether to save them or watch them learn. The crisis began at 6:23 a.m. European time, when Q Prime's Frankfurt deployment attempted to process its first batch of live logistics data, instead of the seamless integration Elliot had promised. Investors, the system returned a single line of error code that nobody at Quantis understood. Authorization required. System architect override pending. I was sitting in my cubicle on the 3rd floor watching the monitoring dashboard I had built. When the first alert started cascading across my screen, Q Prime wasn't just failing, it was failing systematically across every European market. Simultaneously, the algorithm was running, the predictions were generating, but the core deployment authorization was locked behind Clause 17. 4. My phone started buzzing with Slack notifications from the emergency response channel that I technically shouldn't have had access to, but that Mira had secretly added me to using administrative credentials she had inherited from her marketing internship. Urgent. European Q Prime deployment experiencing critical errors. All hands, technical emergency, 7 a.m. PST. Elliot needs immediate engineering support. I could have responded. I could have walked upstairs to the crisis meeting and explained that Q Prime wasn't broken, it was simply waiting for authorization from the person who had built it. But something cold and patient kept me in my chair, watching the panic unfold through digital channels at 7:15 a.m. Elliot's voice echoed through the building's intercom system, requesting all senior technical staff report to conference room A for emergency troubleshooting. I wasn't senior technical staff anymore. I was a data strategy associate, so I stayed at my desk and watched the dashboard. That showed me everything they couldn't see. Q Prime was functioning perfectly. The algorithm was processing data, analyzing patterns, generating predictions with the same 94.7% accuracy I had achieved during development. But every deployment request was being blocked by authorization protocols that required my digital signature at 8:30 a.m. Jordan Alessi, the chief legal officer who had dismissed Clause 17. 4. As boilerplate. Security language sent an urgent email to all engineering staff. Immediate review required. Need technical analysis of licensing documentation for Q Prime deployment authorization. Specifically, Clause 17, 4 in original development agreement. Legal implications unclear. Mind. Unclear. Jordan was finally reading the documentation he had signed 8 months ago, discovering that boilerplate security language was actually a carefully constructed licensing framework that gave me override authority for system-wide deployments. I opened my email and found 17 messages from colleagues asking if I knew anything about Q Prime's authorization requirements, if I had documentation that might explain the deployment failures, if I could provide any insight that might help. Resolve the crisis. I could have helped. I could have walked upstairs and explained that Q Prime required ongoing oversight from its original architect, that Clause 17, 4 wasn't a bug. It was a feature designed to prevent exactly the kind of unauthorized deployment they were attempting. Instead, I forwarded Jordan's email to Malik Serrano with a single line of commentary. They're starting to read the fine print. By 10 a.m., the European clients were demanding explanations for the service disruption that was preventing them from accessing the revolutionary AI platform they had paid millions to implement. Elliot was promising rapid resolution while privately begging engineering teams to find workarounds for authorization protocols they didn't understand. Mira found me during lunch break, her face tight with stress and barely controlled anger. "This is insane," she whispered, sitting across from me in the cafeteria. "They're treating this like a technical malfunction when everyone knows you built Q Prime. Everyone knows you could fix this in 5 minutes. Could I?" I asked. "Don't be coy, Jaya." Mira said, "Half the engineering team is asking why. You're not in the crisis meetings. The other half is wondering why someone with associate-level credentials has more insight into Q Prime's architecture than the head of AI innovation." She was right. Of course, I could resolve the crisis immediately by providing the authorization that Q Prime was requesting, but providing that authorization would validate Elliot's deployment strategy, ignore the technical problems I had identified, and enable Quantis to continue treating me as disposable technical support. "What do you think I should do?" I asked. Mira studied my face, looking for clues about what I was really thinking, about what game I was playing, about whether I was planning to save Quantis or watch them suffer the consequences of their own decisions. "I think," she said carefully, "that you should do whatever serves your interests best, not theirs, at 2 p.m. Rebecca from HR sent me a calendar invitation for an urgent meeting labeled Technical Consultation Emergency Response. The meeting was scheduled for 3 p.m. in Conference Room A, where 24 hours earlier I had been told my salary was being reduced by 70%. I accepted the invitation. Conference Room A was packed with executives, engineers, legal staff, and consultants who had been brought in to analyze the Q Prime crisis. Elliot stood at the front of the room, looking like someone who had discovered that confidence couldn't substitute for competence. "Jaya, thank you for joining us," he said as I entered the room, his voice carrying forced optimism that didn't match the stress lines around his eyes. "We're hoping you can provide some insight into Q Prime's authorization requirements." I sat down at the far end of the table and looked around the room at faces that had celebrated my demotion 2 weeks earlier, now desperately hoping I could solve problems they had created through their own ignorance. "What specifically do you need to know?" I asked. Jordan Alessi opened a laptop and pulled up the licensing documentation that he had previously dismissed as unimportant. Clause 17. 4. Mentions authorization requirements for system-wide deployment. Can you explain what that means technically? Technically, it meant that Q Prime would remain locked until I chose to unlock it. That 17 months of development had included safeguards against exactly the kind of unauthorized deployment they were attempting, that I had built protection into my own algorithm. It means Q Prime requires ongoing oversight from its original architect. I said, "The clause ensures system integrity by preventing deployment without proper technical authorization." "And how do we obtain that authorization?" Rebecca asked. I looked directly at Elliot, whose presentation just 2 weeks earlier had dismissed me as replaceable technical support, whose deployment timeline had ignored every limitation I had documented, whose promises to investors had exceeded the algorithm's actual capabilities. "You ask the original architect." I said. The room fell silent as the implications became clear. They needed me not just for consultation or troubleshooting, but for basic authorization to use the technology I had created. They had reduced my salary, fired me from leadership, and tried to erase me from the narrative. But they couldn't deploy Q Prime. Without my permission, what would that authorization process involve? Jordan asked. I thought about Malik Serrano's offer, about Syntech's understanding of technical limitations, about the business card sitting in my wallet that represented recognition, respect, and the opportunity to control my own innovations. That depends, I said, on the terms being offered. Elliot's face went very still as he realized what I was suggesting, that authorization wasn't just a technical requirement. It was a negotiation. That his billion-dollar deployment was contingent on satisfying someone he had already demonstrated he didn't value. "Perhaps we could discuss this privately," Rebecca said. "Perhaps." I agreed, standing up from the table. "But first I need to make a phone call." I walked out of conference room A, leaving 20 executives to contemplate the difference between owning code and controlling technology, between having access to an algorithm and having permission to use it in the hallway outside. I pulled out my phone and called Malik Serrano. "The crisis has begun," I said when he answered. "They're starting to understand what they actually signed." "And what are you going to do about it?" Malik asked. I looked through the glass walls of conference room, where Quantis leadership was discovering that their most valuable asset was controlled by someone they had tried to make invisible. "I'm going to let them make me an offer," I said, "and then I'm going to compare it to yours. I'll be waiting." Malik said. I hung up and walked back into the room where my former colleagues were about to learn that technical expertise couldn't be outsourced to cheaper alternatives, that authorization couldn't be transferred through corporate restructuring, and that some problems could only be solved by the people who had been smart enough to anticipate them. The press release went live at exactly 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time on a Monday morning when the tech world was drinking coffee and checking weekend emails. The headline appeared simultaneously across TechCrunch, Wired, VentureBeat, and every major industry publication that covered artificial intelligence acquisitions. Syntech acquires predictive AI architect behind revolutionary Q Prime algorithm. My photograph filled the screen. Not a corporate headshot, but the picture I had submitted to Malik's team showing me in my Quantis office, before they had stripped away my nameplate, my title, my recognition, the woman who had built something. That changed everything. The article was precise, surgical, devastating. Dr. Jaya Raman, the original architect of the predictive AI system known as Q Prime, has joined Syntech as Chief of AI Innovation, bringing with her exclusive licensing rights to technology that has been valued at over $1 billion. The move comes amid reports of deployment authorization issues at Quantis Systems, where Dr. Raman was recently reclassified from Senior Machine Learning Engineer to Data Strategy Associate, despite being the sole creator of their flagship AI platform. The exclusive licensing rights, the phrase that would make Jordan Alessi's hands shake. When he read it, the legal reality that Quantis had never understood that my algorithm couldn't be owned, only licensed, and that licenses could be transferred to companies that understood their value. My phone started ringing at 10:03 a.m. first, with calls from journalists who wanted to understand how the creator of a billion-dollar algorithm had been demoted to associate-level compensation, then with messages from former colleagues who were watching their company's stock price drop in real time. By 10:15 a.m., Quantis's stock had fallen 12% as investors processed the implications of losing exclusive access to the technology that had justified their $1 billion acquisition offer. I was sitting in Syntech's conference room on the 42nd floor of a building that overlooked the bay, watching market reactions unfold across multiple screens, while Malik and his executive team monitored the industry. response to what financial reporters were already calling the biggest AI talent acquisition of the year. "Quantis is trying to reach you?" Malik said, showing me his phone, which displayed 17 missed calls from numbers I recognized. Rebecca from HR, Jordan from legal, even Elliot, whose confidence had evaporated somewhere between authorization denied and stock price freefall. "I'm sure they are." I said the second wave of coverage started at 10:30 a.m., when technology blogs began analyzing the technical implications of my departure from Quantis industry experts who understood AI development cycles and deployment requirements, started questioning how a company could lose the architect of their most valuable technology. "This raises serious questions about Quantis's understanding of their own AI capabilities," wrote Sarah Martinez, the AI correspondent for Forbes. "Losing the original developer of Q-Prime suggests either fundamental mismanagement of technical talent or significant gaps in the company's grasp of their technological assets. Mismanagement of technical talent, that was a diplomatic way of saying they had reduced the salary of their most valuable engineer by 70% and expected her to accept erasure gracefully." The third wave began at 11 a.m. when investigative technology journalists started digging into the details of my departure from Quantis. Anonymous sources confirmed that I had been demoted despite creating the algorithm that drove their acquisition. Offer that my salary had been slashed while my title was given to someone with no AI development experience, that I had been systematically erased from technical documentation and company presentations. Multiple sources within Quantis confirm that Dr. Raman was excluded from the leadership team despite being the sole architect of Q-Prime, reported Alex Chen from The Information. The decision appears to have been driven by concerns about narrative consistency for potential investors rather than technical considerations. Narrative consistency. They had been so focused on creating a clean story for investors that they had forgotten the story needed to be true by noon. My LinkedIn profile had been viewed over 5,000 times as technology. Professionals tried to understand how one of the industry's most significant AI breakthroughs had been developed by someone they had never heard of, because her company had kept her invisible. The messages started flooding in around 12:30 p.m., not just from journalists and recruiters, but from engineers who had experienced similar erasure from former colleagues who had watched their innovations attributed to people with better presentation skills from women in technology, who recognized the pattern of being essential but invisible. "I built the recommendation engine that powers our entire platform," wrote Lisa Zhang, a senior engineer at Netflix. "And my manager got promoted to director of AI innovation based on my work, while I was told there wasn't budget for my advancement." Reading your story feels like looking in a mirror. Dozens of similar messages engineers who had built revolutionary systems only to watch other people receive credit recognition advancement, women who had created billion-dollar algorithms and been told they were good at implementation, but not strategy minorities who had solved impossible technical problems and been excluded from the leadership meetings where their solutions were discussed by 1 p.m. The story had evolved beyond corporate politics into something larger, an examination of how the technology industry systematically undervalued the people who created its most important innovations. "The Jaya Raman case exposes a fundamental problem in tech leadership," wrote Maria Rodriguez, in a viral Medium post that would be shared over 15,000 times. "We celebrate CEOs and CTOs who can articulate technical visions, but we erase the engineers who make those visions reality. We reward presentation skills over programming expertise. We promote people who can sell innovation rather than people who can create it." The afternoon brought more devastating analysis from industry experts who had time to review the technical claims Elliot had been making about Q-Prime versus the actual capabilities of the algorithm I had built. The deployment promises made by Quantis leadership appear to exceed the documented limitations of Q-Prime's architecture, wrote Dr. Michael Chang, a professor of computer science at Stanford who specialized in AI system deployment. "Without the original architect's involvement, these commitments to clients may be technically unfeasible." Technically unfeasible, that was academic. Language for Elliot had been promising things that required my authorization and oversight, things that couldn't be delivered by someone who understood marketing better than machine learning. By 3 p.m., 3 major clients had contacted Quantis requesting clarification about the status of their Q-Prime deployments, given the departure of the system's original architect, 2 European logistics companies, and 1 Asian manufacturing conglomerate representing over $400 million in contracted services. Jordan Alessi finally reached me at 3:47 p.m., his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Jaya, we need to talk. The board is demanding immediate clarification about the licensing situation. Clients are questioning our ability to deliver promised services. We need to understand what authorization requirements are still in effect." "I'm no longer a Quantis employee," I said. "I'm the Chief of AI Innovation at Syntec. If you have licensing questions, you should contact our legal department." "This isn't about corporate politics," Jordan said. "This is about contractual obligations. We have clients who have paid for Q-Prime implementation. We need to know if the system can be deployed without your direct involvement." I thought about Clause 17, or about the authorization protocols that would remain locked until I chose to unlock them, about the 17 months I had spent building something that no one else understood completely. "The licensing documentation is quite clear," I said. "Q-Prime requires ongoing oversight from its original architect for system-wide deployment. If Quantis wants to discuss modification of those requirements, they should schedule a meeting with Syntec's business development team." I hung up and walked to the windows of Syntec's conference room looking out over San Francisco Bay, where the afternoon sun was turning the water into molten gold somewhere across the city. Quantis executives were discovering that technical expertise couldn't be replaced by corporate restructuring, that algorithms weren't commodities that could be transferred between departments like office furniture, that the person they had tried to erase was the only person who could authorize the deployments that would determine their company's future. Malik joined me at the window holding 2 cups of coffee that actually tasted good, unlike the industrial sludge they served in Quantis's collaborative workspace. "How does it feel?" he asked. "To watch them realize what they lost?" I thought about the monitoring dashboard I had built, about the European deployment failures, about the 18 months of promises Elliot had made that required my authorization to fulfill. "It feels like justice," I said, but quieter than no. I expected, by 5 p.m., the stock market had closed with Quantis down 18% for the day, while Syntec gained 7% as investors processed the implications of acquiring the architect behind the industry's most advanced predictive AI system. My phone buzzed, with a text message from Mira, who was still technically employed at Quantis, but had been quietly interviewing with Syntec's marketing team. "They're removing all of Elliot's Q-Prime presentations from the company website." She wrote, "Legal is reviewing every public statement he made about deployment capabilities. Board meeting scheduled for tomorrow morning to discuss strategic realignment." Strategic realignment, corporate euphemism for panic. I looked at my reflection in the conference room window, the woman who had been told she was replaceable, who had been demoted to associate-level compensation, who had been erased from the narrative of her own innovation tomorrow. Quantis would discover that some expertise couldn't be replaced, that some control couldn't be transferred, that some problems could only be solved by the people who had been smart enough to anticipate them. But tonight, I was standing in Syntec's headquarters, watching the sun set over a city that was finally learning my name. The email arrived at 6:47 a.m. on Tuesday morning, marked urgent with a subject line that revealed how completely Quantis had misunderstood their situation. Immediate contract termination. Q-Prime authorization failure. Hoffman. Logistics. The largest supply chain management company in Germany was voiding their $127 million contract with Quantis, effective immediately, citing breach of software integrity and failure to deliver promised AI capabilities. They had been the flagship client for Q-Prime's European expansion, the success story Elliot had used to justify his 18-month deployment timeline. I was reading the termination notice on my phone while sitting in Syntec's executive briefing room, where Malik and his senior team were reviewing overnight developments in what the technology press was now calling the Quantis crisis. 2 more terminations came in after midnight, said Jennifer Walsh, Syntex head of business development, Nakamura Manufacturing. Pulled their $89 million contract, and Baltic Shipping suspended their implementation pending clarification of technical leadership. 3 major clients representing over $300 million in contracted revenue had abandoned Quantis within 18 hours of my departure. The market was voting with remarkable clarity about the value of technical expertise versus corporate presentations. My laptop chimed with a calendar notification for a 9 a.m. meeting that I wasn't planning to attend. Emergency board session, crisis management protocol. Rebecca from HR had sent the invitation to my personal email, apparently forgetting that I no longer worked for the company that was discovering the cost of their decisions. "They want you in that meeting," Malik said, reading over my shoulder. Jordan Alessi called 3 times last night offering to discuss licensing modifications. Licensing. Modifications they were finally ready to negotiate after spending weeks treating me like disposable technical support. But negotiation required having something to offer, and Quantis was rapidly running out of leverage at 8:30 a.m., while Quantis executives were gathering for their crisis meeting. TechCrunch published an investigation that had been building since Monday's announcement: how Quantis lost the mind behind their billion-dollar algorithm. The article was devastating comprehensive, reporting that traced my journey from creating Q-Prime to being demoted, erased, and ultimately lost to their primary competitor. It included leaked emails, internal documents, and interviews with anonymous Quantis employees who confirmed the systematic nature of my marginalization. Dr. Raman's demotion appears to have been driven by concerns that her technical expertise complicated the narrative Quantis wanted to present to investors. The article reported, multiple sources confirm that executives preferred having someone with stronger presentation skills leading the AI initiative, even if that person lacked the technical background to understand the technology being presented. The leaked emails were particularly damaging, including Elliot's message about the Jaya problem, and Rebecca's salary analysis that treated a PhD computer scientist with 8 years of AI development experience like an entry-level technical support associate. But the most devastating revelation came from Jordan Alessi himself, who had apparently decided that legal self-preservation required distancing himself from decisions he had previously supported. In retrospect, the licensing framework contained provisions that should have been reviewed more carefully. Jordan told TechCrunch the technical documentation included authorization requirements that weren't fully understood by the business team when deployment decisions were made. Weren't fully understood. Jordan was admitting that Quantis leadership had signed contracts without reading them, approved deployments without understanding requirements, made promises to clients without grasping the technical limitations that made those promises impossible to fulfill by 10 a.m. The business implications were cascading beyond client cancellations. Steinberg International, the conglomerate that had offered $1 billion to acquire Quantis, issued a statement that made their position clear. Our acquisition interest was based on exclusive access to advanced AI technology developed by Dr. Jaya Raman. Given that Dr. Raman and her proprietary algorithms are no longer affiliated with Quantis, we are withdrawing our acquisition offer effective immediately. $1 billion gone in a single paragraph because they had treated their most valuable employee like an interchangeable component. The internal panic at Quantis was visible through social media as employees began updating their LinkedIn profiles with new status indicators, open to work, and seeking new opportunities. Smart people were recognizing a sinking ship and preparing exit strategies. Mira texted me at 10:30 a.m. with updates from inside the crisis meeting. Board is demanding Elliot's resignation. Jordan says the licensing situation is legally complex. Stock has dropped another 8% this morning. Employees are asking if they should be looking for new jobs. Elliot's resignation that was predictable, the charming presenter who had taken credit for my work was discovering that charm couldn't solve problems that required technical expertise. He couldn't provide But the real impact was deeper than executive turnover. Quantis was facing an existential crisis that went beyond stock prices or client contracts. They had built their entire future on technology. They didn't understand controlled by someone they had driven away at 11 a.m. Lena Caldwell, the board member who had quietly supported me during my years at Quantis, broke her silence in an interview with Fortune magazine. The decision to marginalize Dr. Raman was a catastrophic error in judgment, Lena said. She repeatedly warned leadership about deployment timelines and technical limitations. Her concerns were dismissed in favor of optimistic projections that prioritized investor confidence over technical reality. Lena was confirming what industry experts had suspected, that my demotion wasn't an organizational restructuring. It was willful ignorance by executives who preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. The board was presented with deployment schedules that ignored the architect's recommendations. Lena continued. When technical concerns were raised, they were characterized as obstacles to growth rather than essential safeguards for successful implementation obstacles. To growth, I had spent 17 months building Q-Prime and months more documenting its requirements, limitations, and deployment protocols, but my expertise had been reframed as resistance to progress by noon. The technology industry was engaged in a broader conversation about talent retention and technical leadership that extended far beyond Quantis's specific failures. The Jaya Raman situation represents a systemic problem in how technology companies value technical expertise versus presentation skills, wrote Dr. Angela Foster, director of the Center for Technology Ethics at MIT. We're seeing brilliant engineers systematically marginalized by leaders who mistake confidence for competence. The afternoon brought more devastating developments as journalists continued investigating the gap between Elliott's promises and Q-Prime's actual capabilities. Analysis of Quantis's public statements reveals significant discrepancies between claimed AI performance and documented test results, reported The Wall Street Journal. Accuracy rates were overstated by as much as 15%, while deployment timelines ignored technical requirements that Dr. Raman had explicitly documented. Overstated by 15%. Elliott had been promising clients 99% accuracy when Q-Prime's documented performance peaked at 94%. 7% under optimal conditions. He had been selling capabilities that didn't exist based on his fundamental misunderstanding of the technology he was presenting at 3 p.m. Jordan Alessi resigned via email, citing irreconcilable differences regarding risk management and technical oversight. He was abandoning the legal framework he had approved before it could destroy his career. Along with the company he had failed to protect by 4 p.m., Quantis's stock had fallen 31% since Monday morning, wiping out over $800 million in market value, as investors processed the implications of losing exclusive access to the technology that had justified their valuation. Rebecca from HR called me at 4:30 p.m., her voice carrying the kind of desperate professionalism that preceded corporate capitulation. Jaya, the board, would like to schedule a meeting to discuss potential collaboration. Arrangements. We recognize that there may have been miscommunications about your role and compensation. We're prepared to discuss significant adjustments to address any concerns. Miscommunications. They were ready to negotiate after losing 3 major clients, a billion-dollar acquisition, and 31% of their stock value, but negotiation required having something I wanted, and money couldn't repair the trust they had systematically destroyed. I appreciate the call, Rebecca, I said, but I'm very happy in my new position at Syntech. If Quantis is interested in licensing discussions, they should contact our business development team. I hung up and walked to Syntech's conference room, where the team was monitoring real-time coverage of what financial reporters were now calling one of the most expensive talent management failures in Silicon Valley history. Malik was standing at the windows watching helicopters circle Quantis's headquarters, where journalists were gathering to cover the ongoing crisis. "They'll keep calling," he said, "offering more money, more titles, more recognition, anything to get you back." I thought about the monitoring dashboard that was still tracking Q Prime's performance, about the authorization protocols that would remain locked until I chose to unlock them, about the algorithm that could predict everything except the blindness of the people who claimed to control it. It's too late for more. I said, this was never about money, somewhere across. The city Quantis executives were discovering that some departures couldn't be reversed, that some expertise couldn't be replaced, that some trust once broken couldn't be repaired through corporate negotiations. But here in Syntech's conference room, I was watching the sunset paint San Francisco Bay in shades of gold, while planning the future of technology, with people who understood that innovation required more than presentations. It required recognition, respect, and the wisdom to value the minds that created the impossible. The conference room on Syntech's 43rd floor felt different from any space I had occupied at Quantis, not just because of the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of San Francisco Bay or the technology that hummed quietly in walls lined with displays showing real-time data from around the world, but because everyone in the room understood exactly who had built what the Q Prime integration is ahead of schedule, said David Chen, my new deputy director of algorithm development, showing deployment metrics across 17 different client systems. We're seeing consistent 94.6% accuracy rates with full European market calibration completed 3 weeks early. 94.6% accuracy, the real number, not the inflated promises Elliott had been making to investors who never asked to see the underlying test data Q Prime was performing. Exactly as I had designed it to perform when deployed by people who understood its requirements. Mira sat across the conference table reviewing marketing materials that would announce Syntech's expanded AI capabilities to clients who had been watching the Quantis crisis with growing concern about the stability of predictive logistics platforms. We've had inquiries from 47 companies since Monday, Mira reported, including 12 former Quantis clients who want to understand our deployment timeline and technical leadership structure. 12 former Quantis clients companies that had paid millions for access to technology that couldn't be delivered without authorization. I had never provided. They were discovering that algorithms weren't commodities that could be transferred between providers like office supplies. My phone displayed a cascade of notifications that I had been ignoring for 3 days. Interview requests from technology journalists who wanted to understand how I had embedded authorization controls in Q Prime job offers from every major tech company that understood they were competing for expertise that couldn't be easily replicated, messages from engineers who recognized my story as their own. But the message that interested me most had arrived that morning from Dr. Angela Foster, the MIT professor who had been writing about systemic undervaluation of technical talent in the technology industry. Your case has become a catalyst for broader examination of how innovation credit is distributed in Silicon Valley, Dr. Foster wrote, would you be interested in speaking at our conference on technical leadership and recognition next month? Technical leadership and recognition? I had spent 8 years being technically excellent while remaining organizationally invisible, but now my expertise was visible globally, documented and valued by people who understood the difference between creating technology and presenting it. Malik entered the conference room carrying coffee that actually tasted good and a tablet displaying the latest market analysis of what financial reporters were calling the Raman effect, the industry-wide reassessment of how technology companies valued their most innovative employees. Quantis stock opened down another 6% this morning, Malik said, sitting at the head of the table. 3 more clients terminated contracts overnight, and their board is meeting to discuss potential bankruptcy protection. Bankruptcy protection. 8 months ago, Quantis had been preparing for a billion-dollar acquisition based on technology I had created. Now they were contemplating corporate dissolution because they had systematically eliminated the person who made their most valuable asset possible. Any regrets about leaving? Asked Jennifer Walsh, our head of business development. I thought about my cubicle on the 3rd floor, about the squeaky chair and flickering fluorescent lights, about being paid $47,000 to support initiatives rather than lead them, about watching other people present my work while I remained invisible. In collaborative workspaces, none I said the morning session focused on technical architecture for Syntech's next-generation AI platform, a system that would advance beyond Q-Prime's predictive capabilities into real-time optimization that could adjust global logistics networks as conditions changed. I was designing algorithms that would make Q-Prime look like a prototype at 11 a.m. My brother Arjun called from Seattle, where he was working a shift in the emergency room at Harborview Medical Center. Saw your interview on TechCrunch. He said Mom would be proud, you know that, right? Our parents had died when I was 17 in a car accident that had transformed my older brother into my guardian and me into someone who understood that recognition wasn't guaranteed, that the work mattered more than the credit, that excellence was its own reward even when nobody was watching. She always said the best revenge was success. I said, "This isn't revenge." Arjun replied, "This is justice. Justice." I had spent months watching other people receive credit for my innovations, but justice felt quieter than I had expected, more like restoration than retribution. At noon, Malik gathered the senior leadership team for strategic planning that would determine Syntech's expansion into markets that Quantis could no longer serve effectively. We were inheriting clients, relationships, opportunities that required immediate technical leadership. The European logistics sector is essentially open territory, said Marcus Way, who had become our head of international deployment. Quantis can't fulfill existing contracts without authorization. They'll never receive, and their technical credibility has been permanently damaged. Permanently damaged. That was the cost of treating technical expertise as replaceable corporate asset, rather than recognizing it as irreplaceable human knowledge that moved with the people who possessed it. By 2 p.m., I was reviewing architectural specifications for AI systems that would power the next generation of global commerce algorithms that would predict, optimize, and adjust supply chains across multiple continents. Simultaneously, this was work that exceeded anything I had imagined during those late nights in Quantis's empty offices. The afternoon brought confirmation that my departure from Quantis had created opportunities beyond client acquisition. The entire European logistics AI market was reconsidering vendor relationships as companies realized that technology providers needed to demonstrate not just algorithmic capabilities, but technical leadership stability. We're fielding calls from companies that never considered Syntech before. Jennifer reported, "They want to understand our technical team leadership development philosophy, long-term innovation strategy. Everyone wants to know they're working with people who value the minds that create breakthrough technology." Value the minds. I was sitting in a conference room where my technical opinions determined strategic direction, where my architectural decisions shaped product development, where my expertise was recognized, rewarded, and trusted to guide innovation that would define industries. At 4 p.m., I signed the final deployment authorization for Q-Prime's expansion across Asian markets under Syntech's licensing framework. The algorithm I had built would now serve clients across 4 continents, but under terms that recognized its creator's ongoing value. The signature felt different from any document I had signed at Quantis, not just because I was authorizing global deployment of technology I controlled, but because everyone who would benefit from that deployment understood exactly who had made it possible. As the afternoon dissolved into evening, I stood at the conference room windows watching San Francisco Bay reflect the lights of a city that was finally learning that innovation required more than presentation skills. That breakthrough technology emerged from minds that deserved recognition, not erasure. My phone displayed 17 missed calls from Quantis executives who were discovering that some departures couldn't be reversed through negotiation, that some expertise couldn't be replaced through hiring, that some control once lost couldn't be recovered through corporate restructuring. But I was done taking their calls. Tomorrow, I would begin designing AI systems that advanced beyond anything Q-Prime had achieved. Algorithms that would reshape global commerce under the guidance of people who understood that technical excellence required technical leadership. Tonight, I was standing in a room I had earned, watching sunset paint the bay in shades of gold while planning Innovations that would be credited to the person who created them somewhere across the city. Quantis executives were learning that markets rewarded results, not presentations that clients valued. Capability over charisma that the future belonged to companies wise enough to recognize genius when they employed it. But here in Syntech's conference room, the future was being designed by the woman who had always built it. And for the first time in 8 years, my name would appear on everything. I created 6 months later, I sat at the head of Syntech's boardroom table, watching morning light stream through windows that overlooked a city that had learned my name. The contract spread across mahogany reflected everything I had built and everything I would control going forward. The Asia-Pacific expansion exceeds all projections, said Marcus Way, reviewing metrics that showed Q-Prime processing logistics data across 14 countries with the precision I had always known it could achieve. When deployed by people who understood its architecture, we're seeing 94.8% accuracy rates with full integration completed ahead of schedule. 94.8% accuracy better than anything Quantis had ever documented, because we had implemented the calibration protocols I had specified the testing phases Elliot had dismissed. The market-specific adaptations that required months of careful adjustment across the table. Malik smiled as he signed the final pages of our multi-continent expansion agreement, a document that would establish Syntech as the dominant force in predictive AI logistics while ensuring that every innovation bore the name of its creator, Dr. Jaya Raman, Chief Innovation Officer. The signature line read beneath contract terms that granted me complete autonomy over technical development, full control of research direction, and equity stakes that reflected my actual contribution to the company's value. My phone lay silent on the table, displaying 23 unread messages from a number I recognized. Elliot's desperate attempts to reach me over the past week had evolved from apologetic to pleading to increasingly frantic as he apparently realized that some bridges couldn't be rebuilt through persistence. I hadn't listened to the voicemails, hadn't read the texts, hadn't responded to emails that promised recognition, compensation titles that should have been offered before I had created something that transformed industries. The morning news played silently on the boardroom displays showing coverage of Quantis's final bankruptcy filing. The company that had once been valued at over $1 billion was being liquidated for parts their offices, emptied their talent scattered to competitors who understood how to value innovation. Former Quantis executives declined to comment on the role that talent management decisions played in the company's collapse. The reporter noted, but industry analysts cite the departure of key technical personnel as a primary factor in the loss of major client contracts. Key technical personnel. They still couldn't say my name, even as they reported on consequences of forgetting it. Mira entered the boardroom carrying coffee and the latest industry coverage that continued to examine what business schools were now teaching as a case study in catastrophic leadership failure. 3 more former Quantis engineers started this week, she reported, settling into her role as Syntech's Director of Strategic Communications. And we've had inquiries from 17 others who want to work somewhere that credits technical contributions appropriately. I looked around the boardroom where every wall displayed innovations that bore my signature. Every screen showed systems that operated under my architectural guidance. Every success was documented with proper attribution to the minds that created it. At 10 a.m., I signed the final deployment authorization expanding Q-Prime across Latin American markets. The algorithm I had built in 17 months of sleepless nights would now optimize global commerce across 6 continents but under licensing. Terms that explicitly required ongoing oversight from its original architect, all operations to remain under direct oversight of Dr. Jaya Raman. The clause read unchanged from the protection I had embedded months ago when paranoia felt like preparation. Authorization required for any system-wide modifications or deployment expansions. Clause 17. 4 had evolved from safeguard to guarantee that recognition couldn't be erased through corporate restructuring, that control couldn't be transferred to people who understood presentations better than programming. My laptop chimed with a new message from Dr. Angela Foster at MIT confirming my keynote address next month at the Conference on Technical Leadership and Innovation Recognition. Your case has catalyzed industry-wide examination of how we value the minds that create breakthrough technology, she wrote. Speaking to the next generation of engineers about maintaining authorship of their innovations could prevent countless future cases of systematic erasure. Systematic erasure. I would stand before auditoriums of brilliant minds and tell them what I had learned: that expertise without control was vulnerable, that innovation without protection could be claimed by people who never understood its complexity, that the most revolutionary act was sometimes simply refusing to be invisible. At noon, Malik announced the completion of our acquisition of 3 former Quantis clients who had terminated their contracts when they realized the technology they had purchased required authorization from someone no longer employed by their vendor, effective immediately. Hoffman Logistics, Nakamura Manufacturing, and Baltic Shipping will be migrating to Syntech's AI platform, Malik said, with full deployment expected within 60 days under the direct supervision of our Chief Innovation Officer. Chief Innovation Officer. My reflection in the boardroom windows showed a woman who had earned every title she held, every decision she controlled, every innovation she would create outside the windows. San Francisco glittered under afternoon, sun, a city where fortunes changed as quickly as code compiled, where recognition could be earned by minds brilliant enough to build the impossible and wise enough to protect it. My phone buzzed one final time with Elliot's latest message, but I powered it off without reading words that had lost their relevance months ago when I had walked out of a conference room where people who didn't understand technology made decisions about its future. I picked up my pen and signed the expansion contract that would establish new standards for AI deployment across global markets. My signature dark and decisive beneath terms that would remain under my control, regardless of who wanted to claim credit for what I had built somewhere across the city. Former Quantis executives were learning that some departures created permanent consequences, that some mistakes couldn't be corrected through negotiation, that the future belonged to companies wise enough to recognize genius when they employed it. But here in Syntech's boardroom, I was designing that future writing algorithms that would reshape commerce under the guidance of people who understood that breakthrough technology emerged from minds that deserved more than erasure. The contract was signed, the future secured, the silence, finally complete, my name, appeared on everything I had created and everything I would build next. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.